Oh, hello everybody, I'm Claire and welcome to my video blog. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is that bonkers fella Juncker. There was a headline that was going around a couple of days ago in which he said that borders were the worst invention ever. This is Jean Claude Juncker, the president of the EU executive, I believe it is, and he said that borders were the worst invention ever. Now, I want to take this apart because it demonstrates the complete intellectual ineptitude of the people who are running this EU show. So he says EU borders are the worst idea ever, right? Now, the way he says this, it's as if somebody sat down, some politician sat down, and they sat round a table and said, "Oh well, how should we organise the world? Oh, yes, let's have this borders invention. Oh, what's that?" As if borders had not been a feature of existence ever since life on this planet. Systems theory, as I've mentioned in other occasions, systems theory demonstrates that any viable system must have boundaries, input, output, homeostatic regulatory mechanisms, and those kind of things that we associate with either well, pretty much anything from a single-celled organism up to large multi-celled organisms like human beings, or indeed organisations of organisms such as tribes, nations, sovereign states, and so forth. And borders, as we see today, are only a legal formalisation of personal space and tribal territorial boundaries which have existed since the beginning of time, and these have been necessary because single-celled organisms would not have developed had they not been able to have some homeostatic control of what went on inside them, and how they chose what nutrients to take in, which would be the case of trade and immigration, and what to get rid of. And yet our political leaders, well, fortunately not much longer for the UK, hopefully, but our political leaders don't seem to have any understanding of these basic philosophical or indeed scientific concepts. I had a conversation with somebody who I would identify as quite a far left cultural Marxist about a year ago, just as the migrant wave was kicking off, late September, I think it was, early October. And she was suggesting to me that politics was as much of a science as psychology or philosophy. As if psychology, which, you know, the model of, surely the model of a state has to be the individual. We have to respect the individual in as large a way as possible through the extension into the modern nation. and yet politics actually seems to be these days a system of basically implementing propositional ideals, as if the proposition state of the United States should be a model for all other nations. Well, that was a constructed nation, and so they have the right to have their constitution and proposition nation status. But here in Europe we have nation states which have existed for centuries, and in some cases you could say millennia. Italy, Greece, and elsewhere, as a concept, and the boundaries have gone backwards and forwards depending on the sway of local power, as one might expect. But when one looks at the natural world, if one sees the territorial boundaries of migrational herds, they need certain territories, and they might move around, and other territorial creatures might have a more sedentary territorial basis but all organisms, certainly higher organisms, need territorial extensions around them, particularly land mammals, and the EU leaders such as Juncker seem to have this idea that we can entirely dispense with the whole evolutionary history of life on this planet and how our own species has evolved, and the history of our species and the subspecies as well, over tens of thousands of years, where we have all in the past occupied certain different territories. We have adapted to the environmental conditions in those territories, so that Northern Europeans are more adapted to long-term planning, whereas people in Africa are more adapted to the dangers that are present there, and the fact that you don't have to plan for cold winters. Shelters are much less demanding, and these territories where these societies, where these subspecies of humanity have developed, they have distinct geographical boundaries which translate into modern political borders, and yet the likes of Jean Claude Juncker, which by the way his name means Little Lord, and he was Prime Minister of the microstate of Luxembourg for 18 years. I've just looked up, and he's quite clearly an agent of the New World Order. Before he was elected by a group of cronies, I had a little bit of a look at this, and it was apparently there was quite some concern expressed a couple of years ago as to his drinking habits. Apparently he does consume rather a lot of alcohol, and you've probably seen the videos of how he likes to greet people in public by slapping them on the face. So this chap is a drunk, right, who has no understanding of the philosophical background of science and evolution. He is somebody who wants to really, what we have here is international communism. It's just like the USSR 2.0. And this is why I think we hear a lot of people calling it the EU SSR, and this I think is why we wanted to get out here, out of the EU here in the United Kingdom, and I think it was a very good thing that we did too, because we have this chap who wants to right? Remember, he wants to have an EU army, which will no doubt be used to enforce decisions on countries like Hungary that might not necessarily agree with them. He wants to have a central tax regime, so that if we had remained in the EU, we would be subject to tax decisions made in Brussels by the likes of people like Jean Claude Juncker, somebody who has no understanding of the basic tenets of science. This is really important. It's really important to understand this. These people, such as Jean Claude Juncker, they like to they like to secretly try and implement long-term political strategies which have been implemented from ideologies such as the Fabian Society had, which is represented rather well in their 1910 Fabian stained glass window, which was recently associated with Tony Blair, so I think that's a pretty good giveaway as to what it's about. It showed an image of George Bernard Shaw smashing an image of the world, which was being held in pincers by Sidney Webb, who was one of the other co-founders of the Fabian Society, which, by the way, had the coat of arms was a picture of a wolf wearing a sheep's pelt. So it's deception, really, isn't it? And the image of the world being smashed showed some writing which said, remake the world more to your heart's desire. And this is a tremendous arrogance on the part of these leftist people, because they want to literally smash the world. We have a world which has evolved according to nature, and we have nations which are agglomerations of tribal groups, and this would appear to be the natural way, and you know, more dominant groups will increase their influence, and this is the way of nature. If you have, you know, I'm thinking of what's happened with red squirrels in this country. You know, we have red squirrels, and grey squirrels have outcompeted them. Fortunately, there are a few isolated places where they are able to survive, and I believe they're still there on the Isle of Man and Scandinavia and places like that. But you see that when you have one tribal group that becomes stronger, then it displaces others, and this is just a fact of nature. So these tribal agglomerations that we call nations, they form boundaries to protect themselves. We look in the animal world, we have creatures like, you know, turtles, that have, you know, shells around them, and this is really what a border is. It's to keep out predators. And the people like Jean Claude Juncker say a lot about how nations are the cause of war. Well, now, this is a very contentious statement, and they just say, oh well, in the past nations have had war, you know, but we also have a lot more examples of nations that have been at peace with each other and without having political homogenization, unification amongst other states. And even if, as Mr. Juncker suggests, all borders would be might be dissolved, well, the EU still has the Schengen zone borders, doesn't it? And this was the failure to maintain the Schengen zone borders was a big part of what's gone wrong over the last year since Merkel declared that Germany would take all comers. So one must assume, one might infer, that President Juncker, when he says that borders are a bad idea and that all borders should be open, he's presumably talking about the Schengen zone borders as well. Otherwise, why would he not make a distinction? This is the international communism that we see, international communism 2.0, which is being attempted to be implemented by the EU hierarchies, and the dissolution of borders is a crucial and essential part of this project they have. So they have to basically deride and run down and criticise everything they possibly can about borders, even though borders arriving as we have them today out of evolutionary boundaries, territorial boundaries, even, you know, in small areas we have human personal space. I mean, it's not past my attention that paedophiles are people who notoriously are unable to respect personal boundaries, the personal boundaries of others, the personal boundaries particularly of younger people who may not have the kind of strongly developed personal boundaries that adults might have. And we have, of course, these mass sexual assault which has been taking place as a result of migrant people who all seem to come from an Islamic background, where these different standards are assumed. But in a way, Europe is behaving in a kind of childlike way, or at least the Juncker's little lord. I hadn't thought about that. But we have this thing, don't we, whereby we're treating incomers who have no documentation frequently with what Peter Gabriel might call the trust of a child. I was just looking at a video by, I think it's Black Pigeon Speaks, earlier today, and there were all these images of women primarily in Germany last autumn with holding signs up. And it's complete childlike trust and naivety, and this is because we have grown up within society in Western Europe within the last 70 years of such peace, such prosperity, such safety, that we've become unaware that outside of our borders there is not this peace, this prosperity, this safety. And that's why idiots like Jean Claude Juncker suggest that we should just dissolve all these borders. And I think this is frankly irresponsible, but it's also intellectually incompetent, that people who should be considering the preservation and protection of our people are actually actively seeking to do the very thing which will lead us all into danger, and is absolutely guaranteed to lead to the destruction of Western civilization. Because, as Donald Trump says, if you don't have borders, if you don't have a border, you don't have a country. And surely this must be just obvious to anybody. I mean, look back over history. the thousands of years of history that are recorded since ancient Sumeria. It's all based on territory, it's all based on occupation and control of territory by tribal groupings, and the moment you allow ingress of entirely different tribal groupings into your nation, into your territory, then you can guarantee that within a couple of generations this other groups will be seeking to dominate that territory, and the original founder population will be at best challenged, quite possibly displaced, and quite possibly ethnically cleansed. So that's what the policies of the EU leaders are precipitating us into, and if they are not doing this because they're completely intellectually incompetent and utterly stupid, then there must be rewards in them further down the line where they know what's going to happen, but I'm sure that they expect that they'll be alright, because the globalists will see them, and I'm sure in his 20-odd years of being at the political top, I'm sure that Mr. Juncker has scratched a few backs, but since he's working with a hypothesis which has no basis in actual evidence and scientific reality, then certainly it will be the case that what he is telling us is likely to happen, and won't it be so wonderful when all these borders are gone, is probably almost certainly entirely the opposite. So I think he is a Pied Piper, and we have to speak out against it. I hope I've made some sense with this video, and if you like it, I hope you'll share it and like it and pass it on. Thank you very much. Systems theory, as I've mentioned in other occasions, systems theory demonstrates that any viable system must have boundaries, input, output, homeostatic regulatory mechanisms, and those kind of things that we associate with either well, pretty much anything from a single-celled organism up to large multi-celled organisms like human beings, or indeed organisations of organisms such as tribes. Oh, hello everybody, I'm Claire, and welcome to my video blog. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is that bonkers fella Juncker. There was a headline that was going around a couple of days ago in which he said that borders were the worst invention ever. This is Jean Claude Juncker, the president of the EU executive, I believe it is, and he said that borders were the worst invention ever. Now, I want to take this apart because it's demonstrating nations, sovereign states, and so forth. And borders, as we see today, are only a legal formalisation of personal space and tribal territorial boundaries which have existed since the beginning of time, and these have been necessary because single-celled organisms would not have developed had they not been able to have some homeostatic control of what went on inside them, and how they chose what nutrients to take in, which would be the case of trade and immigration, and what to get rid of. And yet our political leaders, well, fortunately not much longer for the UK, hopefully, but our political leaders don't seem to have any understanding of these basic philosophical or indeed scientific concepts. I had a conversation with somebody who I would identify as quite a far left cultural Marxist about a year ago, just as the complete intellectual ineptitude of the people who are running this EU show. So he says EU borders are the worst idea ever, right? Now, the way he says this, it's as if somebody sat down, some politician sat down, and they sat round a table and said, "Oh well, how should we organise the world? Oh, yes, let's have this borders invention. Oh, what's that?" As if borders had not been a feature of existence ever since life on this planet.